It was almost 9 o'clock. Outside the kitchen window, a lone crow winged by the dark, only the glint of its eyes visible as it screeched past. Finishing up my work for the night, I folded away my documents and closed my laptop, stifling in a yawn. My eyes were hazy from staring at the screen for so long, and I rubbed them with my fingers as I stretched out of my seat. Lily had been in bed for an hour already, but I was in the habit of checking in on her before I went to sleep myself. There were no lights on upstairs, so I felt blindly through the dark for the door to my daughter's room, my fingers finding the door first, then the handle. I opened it as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake her, and poked my head inside. It took a moment to adjust to the gloom. Then suddenly, half a dozen eyes peered out from the darkness. Lily's toys were stacked haphazardly on top of her dresser. Their glassy eyes seemed uncannily alive in the moonlight trickling through the window. I turned my gaze towards the bed and let out a soft whimper. Lily wasn't there. Fumbling for the light switch on the wall, the bulb flickered to life, confirming my fears. The bed was empty. The covers had been thrown back and the pillow was creased. But when I went over to feel the sheets, the bed was cold. She'd been gone for some time. I did a full search of the room, checking beneath the bed and in the closet, making sure she wasn't hiding, but she was nowhere to be found. Backtracking out of my room, I called her name. The bathroom door was open and empty inside, and she wasn't in my room when I checked either. That only left downstairs, but wouldn't have seen her when I was working in the kitchen. "Lily?" I called, checking each room again. "Lily, where are you, sweetie?" The silence that followed made me uneasy. Where had she gone? I hadn't heard her get up, hadn't seen her come downstairs. Had someone taken her? Panic rumbled through me, making my body quiver, but I tried not to dwell on the thoughts rushing through my head. I hadn't checked everywhere yet. She might still be here. I went downstairs, calling her name as I went, but she wasn't in the kitchen or the living room or the utility room. She wasn't here. I cast my mind back to her room. The window had been shut and the front door was locked. The only other exit was the back door, leading from the utility room to the back garden. It was the only place in the house that I couldn't see or hear from the kitchen. Hurrying to the door, I felt my heart sink when I tried the handle. It was open. It was drizzling lightly when I stepped out, obscuring part of my vision, but I saw enough. "Lily!" I cried breathlessly. Squinting against the gloom, at the bottom of the garden was a figure, her blonde hair glowing in the moonlight. It was my daughter. "Lily, what are you doing?" My feet skid against the grass as I jogged towards her, grimacing as water ran down my shoes, ice cold against my skin. "Lily, what are you doing? Come back inside." She didn't respond. She was facing away from me, staring in the trees, with her head angled slightly to the side, as though she was watching something. "Lily?" My voice was more tentative now, almost reluctant to disturb her. But what was she looking at? Just as I was reaching for her, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide and glassy, and her hand, a teddy bear, dangled by its leg. "Lily, what are you doing out here?" She stared at me. Rain trickled down over her nose, sticking pieces of blonde hair to her face. "I saw something out here, Mommy," she said softly. "What? Who?" I looked up and around quickly, but there was nobody there. Our garden was fenced with thick, tangled trees, making it difficult to reach the open field beyond. "You saw someone in the garden?" She nodded, pointing to the ground. In the mud was a single footprint, larger than either of ours. I took hold of Lily's arm, pulling her to me. She was cold to the touch, but she wasn't shivering. She barely seemed bothered by the rain. I held her close as I scanned the trees. Darkness pulled between them, but there was nobody lingering among them. "Why didn't you come and tell me?" I asked. "He waved at me," she said with a slight pout. "I thought he wanted to speak with me." "He?" The words got caught in my throat, and I flicked another glance towards the trees. "Come on, let's get inside. Come on, let's go inside." She said nothing as I led her quickly back to the house, shutting the back door and locking it, before leading her up to her room. The window in her room looked directly onto the garden and the field beyond. After settling Lily back in bed, I went over to look and looked out. The field was basked in darkness, but I could see no figure lurking around it. Making sure the window was locked tight, I drew the curtains and shut and told Lily that if she saw this man again, she should come and tell me immediately. She nodded and eventually fell back to sleep. I stayed with her for a few more minutes, thanking God that whoever it was hadn't taken her. How she managed to get outside without me hearing, I didn't know, but I had a feeling I wouldn't be able to sleep much that night, worrying about how secure we were in our house. I'd never had a stranger enter the premises before, and I was at a loss with what to do. I could phone the police. I doubt they'd be able to do much without evidence or positive identification. Of course, there was also the possibility that Lily was simply imagining the man. Her father, my husband, John, had just passed away 2 weeks ago. The house still didn't feel quite right without his presence. Lily hadn't really said much about her father since his passing. Perhaps this is her way of coping with its absence. Regardless, this was really out of character for Lily. Watching her asleep, she looked at peace. I pulled over covers to her shoulder and kissed her on the forehead. I made my way to the window once more, still puzzled by the footprint in the mud. It could have been an old footprint from John. I left Lily's door ajar and made my way to my room. I laid in bed, removing my glasses, placing on the nightstand. I turned on the television and flipped through a few channels with the volume off, in hopes that my mind would be able to get some rest. At some point shortly thereafter, I felt my eyelids starting to grow heavy. It must have been nearing 3 in the morning when something woke me up. Groggy with sleep, I pushed myself up and blinked against the darkness. There was someone standing at the end of my bed. Jolting, I reached for the lamp beside me and quickly put on my glasses. Lily was staring at me, blinking, sleep-glazed eyes. "Lily, what's the matter?" I asked, trying to calm my thudding heart. She cuddled her bear to her chest. "The man," she started, cocking her head. "He's back." I quickly got up from the bed and ran into her room. I stared out into the darkness but saw nothing. Lily came shuffling along beside me, grabbing by hand. "Where did you see the man?" I asked her, my voice shaky. She said nothing, turning back out of the room. I yelled at her to not go anywhere. Startled tears began to form in her eyes. I peered out into the empty void before closing the curtains once more. I walked back into my room with the lily in hand. I picked up my cell phone, ready to place a call. Before realizing I wasn't sure who to call, I wasn't at the point yet where I thought I needed to call the police. But I knew I needed to get a hold of someone. The closest family I had was my younger sister, Monica, who lived about 15 minutes away. It was Friday night, so the odds were she was probably still up. I decided to text her, perhaps unsure of what else to do. As I waited for a response, I sat Lily down on the bed next to me. "What were you doing up?" I asked her, doing my best to sound as calm as possible. "He woke up," she responded. "What do you mean he woke up?" "Lily, look at me, sweetheart. I need you to tell me exactly what happened before you came and woke me up." She shook her head in affirmation. As she began to speak, my phone buzzed. "Hold on just one sec," I told her as I looked down at my phone. It was a reply from my sister. Her message read, I just got home from a friend's house. Why? Is everything okay? Lily said she saw someone outside, but I didn't see anyone. I wrote back, I'm just really freaked out. Is it okay if I come over? She asked. While I felt guilty having her come over for something that could possibly turn out to be nothing, I was relieved she offered. Yes, please, I wrote back before placing my phone back on the nightstand. At this point, I was fairly certain we weren't going back to bed. I focused my attention back to Lily, who was staring at me with a look of uncertainty. Your Aunt Monica is coming, I whispered to her, forcing a smile. Why is she coming? She asked. I opened my mouth to speak but remained silent, as I wasn't quite sure how to respond to her. I didn't want to lie to her, but at the same time I struggled with figuring out how to best communicate my fears without scaring her too much. Do you want to go downstairs and wait for your aunt? I asked. She nodded her head, and we made our way down into the hallway. As we reached the top of the stairs, I stopped her from taking another step with my hand. She looked up at me as I listened carefully for another unusual sound. Hearing nothing out of the ordinary, we walked downstairs and headed to the kitchen. I turned on the lights and put on a pot of coffee. Lily sat at the table, still clutching onto her bear. Do you want a snack? I asked her as I opened the fridge. She shook her head no. I went to the pantry and took out a box of cookies, placing them on the table. Shortly thereafter, I received a text. I looked at my phone to find a message from Monica, saying she was outside. I went to the door and looked out my window. Once I was sure there was nothing out of the ordinary, I opened the door and waved at her. She ran up and gave me a strong hug. It's good to see you, she said as she walked into the kitchen. I locked the door behind her and followed behind her. Hey there, she exclaimed. She gave Lily a hug. Can I get a cup of that? Monica asked as she pointed to the cup of coffee I had in hand. Of course, I said, as I prepared her a cup. She walked over to me on the other side of the kitchen, and I could tell she wanted to speak to me without Lily hearing. So what happened? She asked, her head a few inches away from mine. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, I responded. Been a really weird night. I handed her her cup of coffee and some sugar. I walked upstairs after I was done working and couldn't find Lily. I searched for her all over the house and finally found her outside. She said she saw a man and that she might have thought it was her dad. Did you see anyone? She asked, her full attention on me. No, I didn't see anyone. But after I brought her back inside, we went to bed, and that's when she woke me up. She said she saw the man again. I went to her room, looked out the window, but saw no one. I believe she saw someone. Lily isn't the type to make up stories, but at the same time, she really scared me. Are you saying you don't think there was anyone actually there? She said. I don't know. Part of me thinks she's doing it for attention. I know how bad that sounds, but this has really made me realize just how little attention I've given her over these past couple of weeks. After John, I buried myself in my work. I guess I haven't really spent much time with her. Do you think about calling the cops? She asked. And say what? My daughter keeps seeing her dead father in the backyard? Please, come talk some sense into her. Monica placed her hand on my shoulder and proceeded to give me a hug. That didn't come out right, I said, lowering my head in shame. It's okay, she said. The truth is, Monica, the idea of her actually seeing John scares me just as much as she saw an actual man out here. I know that sounds weird, but can I talk to her? She asked. Yeah, sure, go ahead, I responded. Monica walked over to Lily and sat next to her on the kitchen table. Hey, Lily, can I ask what happened tonight? Your mom said you saw a man outside your window. Lily was playing with her bear, only briefly turning to Monica to affirm with her head. What did he look like? Lily shrugged her shoulders. How did you know he was outside? He woke me up, she responded. How did he wake you up? He was throwing rocks at my window. Monica turned to look at me with a face of concern. I walked closer to them as they continued talking. And what did you see when you looked out the window? He was just outside. He waved at me to come down. Is that why you went downstairs? I butted in. I bent next to Lily and grabbed a hold of her head, turning it to face me. What happened when you went downstairs, Lily? He wasn't there, she responded as she jerked her head away from my hands. Monica walked over to the edge of the kitchen and followed behind her. Maybe you should call the police just to be safe, she said. Yeah, I think you're right. I feel like such an idiot. I walked into the living room and made the call while Monica stayed in the kitchen with Lily. I made the operator aware of our situation and that they said they would be sending someone over immediately. We waited in the kitchen for an officer to arrive, not really saying much. We were all startled when we heard a knock on the front door. As I approached the door, I could see the beams of the red and blue, the siren lights making their way through the window. I opened the door and greeted the officers as they made their way inside. It's okay if we take a look around, the officer asked. Take a look everywhere, I said, motioning all over the house with my hands. But you don't have a reason to believe someone is inside the home. Is that correct? He asked. That's right, but it would make us feel a lot safer, I responded with a nervous laugh. That's not a problem, ma'am. We'll take a look. I sat on the sofa with Monica and Lily sitting next to me as we waited for the officers to sweep the house. They took about 25 minutes to look all over the house, including the backyard and nearby wooded area. They returned and assured me that there was no one in the house or in the vicinity. I thanked them profusely and apologized for wasting their time. They were nice enough to reassure me it was their job and asked that I not hesitate to call back if I experienced anything else unusual. I feel a lot better, Monica said as I closed the door behind the officers. Yeah, I think calling them was definitely a good idea, I responded. At least now we know, right? Well, we all sat on the couch for a while, just staring at each other, until Monica broke the silence. Should we watch a movie or something? It's not like we're going back to bed. I looked down at Lily and shook her head in affirmation, smiling. We made our way to the room and snuggled in bed while I put on a movie. As the movie was starting, Monica turned to look at us. You all have a lot of trees near the house, she said. I stared back at her, unsure of how to interpret her comment. I've seen trees in the backyard, you know. The ones that grow those little acorns or whatever they are. I know I've heard them fall on the house before. It can sound a lot like rocks on the windows. That's probably what you heard, Lily. Just acorns falling on your window. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know how much sense Monica's explanation made, but it made it feel a little more at ease. See, Lily, I said, brushing her hair back with my hand. You probably just had a bad dream. The acorns woke you up both times. You think it was a dream? She asked while looking up at me. It could have been, I responded. Well, the acorns only woke me up the first time, she said. What woke you up the second time? I asked. The second time it was a man going up to the attic in the hallway, she responded.